Alrighty, a brief overview and intro about what we're all about. We're a podcast. We're all teens, except for Nicole, of course. And we're all 4 teens. So we're focused on the LGBTQ plus community and BIPOC and all of it has to do with mental health. We're based in Portland, Oregon, and we've been that way since September 2020 to currently. We're representing a larger group of about 12 people. And we're just going to be talking about how to make a podcast and all the things you have to think about before you do that and how to effectively run one, especially one that's led by youth. And just a heads up, feel free to put questions into the chat. All right. Okay. So our podcast team, obviously we're not fully representing our team, all the lovely people in our picture, not just because of work, school, and all those other things we have to deal with over the summer. So yeah, we're just wanting to acknowledge that we do not fully represent our full podcast team as 3 white people. So yeah.
All right, y'all. Oh, now we're gonna head into the icebreaker. It's gonna be a mock interview, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in the next slide. All right, so you're gonna be put into an 8-minute breakout room with one random person, hopefully, who you do not know. And the person who is youngest in that breakout room will be the interviewer first. And then we'll send a message at 4 minutes and you'll switch who's the interviewer. So the goal of this is to learn a few interesting things about each other, as well as simulating what a real podcast interview might look like. So you want to make sure to ask interesting questions and follow-up questions and make sure it flows smoothly. After 8 minutes, you'll be brought back into the main room and each of you will share something that you learned about your partner in the chat. So it could be their favorite color. It could be in a crazy experience they had on transit. But just make sure that your partner is okay with you sharing whatever you're going to share. Does anyone have any questions before we get sent off? Feel free to put them in the chat if so. But here are some example questions. So you could be like, hey, what's an interesting experience you've had on public transit? And then follow that up with something like, oh, wow, that sounds crazy. What was it like for you? What were you experiencing while that happened? You could be like, what's your favorite podcast? And then you could ask them follow-up questions about what it is and why they like it. What's your favorite niche sport or hobby, favorite food, favorite color, any things that you think will bring out a really interesting answer that you would want to hear on a podcast. Sounds like everyone learned some interesting things about their partner. And now I'm going to pass off to Anna to do some stuff about themes and logistics.
Yeah. Hopefully that felt like kind of like an interview, because that's how interviews usually go. All right, creating your own podcast, all about the logistics.
Logistics.
So part 1. Oh, it's you.
Logistics part 1. So some things we'll cover in this section is supplies, recruitment, how to post podcasts to providers, and editing the podcast. Some supplies you'll need are a good microphone. If this isn't accessible to you, a computer mic or the mic on your headphone can work, but it won't be as good of quality. And then for your setup, use more soft textured things, and this will just provide less environment noise and improve the overall quality of your podcast. Then for a DIY setup, a couple of things you'll need are a microphone, a computer, or a phone, and then headphones, blanket or closet space, again, just for the quality, and then water, something to drink. Then how to upload your podcast to the world. Upload to podcasts like SoundCloud, use an MP3 or WAV file, and then make sure you share the RSS link and podcast info to anywhere podcasts are found, such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, etc. Recruitment. To start your recruitment, you'll need to decide what type of podcast and what type of people you will need. And then one way we recommend starting is with a Google form, just to get interest for who would like to help with your podcast. And make sure to get this out to your target audience. Like for us, our podcast, we target high school students. So we send it out to high school teachers and teens who are already actively involved in their community, and just teens in general, to make sure everyone knows this isn't something that's available to them to be a part of. There are two types of podcast types, solo and big group. Solo consists of the interviewees and editor, and some pros of this are it's simple and it works on your own schedule. But then the cons are it's difficult to manage social media and events, and it's just you're doing more of it with the work. You're doing all of the work by yourself, which just naturally puts a lot more pressure on you. And then for big groups, this contains the interviewees, editor, social media, artist, interviewer, and then script writer. And then some pros of this are you just have so much more potential because of the people you can have. And you also have more diverse voices, and you'll just naturally produce more episodes. And there's just so much more possibilities for what you can do with your podcast if you have a big group. But then the cons of this are it's difficult to manage everyone's schedule since, for example, our podcast, we're all active teenagers, and we have to balance things like school and work, and that just naturally makes finding a time to meet so much harder. Editing the podcast. For editing the podcast, there are two options. You can find someone to edit, which editing is just naturally a lot of work, and you can hire someone that is like a professional, but this does cost money, and sometimes you don't always have that extra money to spare to pay for an editor. And then you can also find another teen in your community or someone that could learn that's into audio editing and would like to do it on the side. Or you can have someone on your team do it. And the pros of this are it's just cheap and you get to learn a new skill. But then the cons is it takes a lot of time to learn and a lot of patience. There are plenty of resources if you do decide to have someone on your team learn how to edit, because there's just so many, like just YouTube search how to edit a podcast, and I'm sure you'll come up with plenty of resources.
Okay, part 2. So all about meetings, how you organize those with your whole team, how we funded our podcast, how we did it for free, and how we interviewed our guests. So meetings, they're pretty important to get the team all together and to create those episodes. So the most important thing is to find a time that works for everybody. And some of the tools we found that were most helpful are things like Eventbrite, Google Calendar, so it pops up on everybody's feed, and Doodle, so you can find the best times for everybody. And agendas, these are also super important to keep things on track. And to do that, it's good to designate a note taker and a facilitator, because we've had meetings where things can get off track pretty easily when you all know each other and like each other. So having that designated person is super important. And also make sure to create a super consistent schedule, because it's good to have people it's in their mind that's going to be at that time and they don't forget. So funding. The two major ways that we found money, mostly from grants. And so if some people who might not know what grants are, basically you go to an organization with an idea. So let's say you have a podcast right about mental health. You might want to make it more niche, be like, oh, teen therapy, how you find a therapist as a teen. And then you go to those organizations, be like, this is my cool idea. Can you give me money for it? And so you might have to like write a little essay or something for them to get that money. And then there's also awards. So coordinating with like sources of strength is a great one that we have. Yeah, and just showing them all the cool work you've done and getting awards for that. All right, interviews. This is like the meat of the podcast. So first step you really want to do is when you're in those meetings is you draft questions beforehand, because you might think that you'll just be able to come up with them on the fly, but oftentimes it doesn't work, especially your first time. And then drafting transitions can also help, because something I'm not very talented at is having like flowing transitions between questions, so the conversation just moves easier. The second thing is to find interviewees. So make sure you're researching them as much as you can. Make sure that they connect with your episode and subject, and you're not just interviewing this random person that you thought connected to it, but really doesn't. So making sure you have those quality people, setting up a time that works with everybody. You can use those like Doodle or Eventbrite to make that work. And then have a backup plan. This is like pretty important, because a lot of times when we try to interview people, they just don't show up, or something doesn't work, or their car breaks down, who knows. And be just prepared to reschedule or find a new person. Part 2. So make sure to test your equipment beforehand, because sometimes that will not work and you'll be in the middle of the episode and everything breaks down, or your audio doesn't come out the way you want to. And the editor can't do anything about that, right? Also use Ringer or Zoom. We've used Ringer mostly because it's really a great tool for recording your audio and it sounds really nice. We haven't really used Zoom that much because the audio isn't as great, but it's also a good way to just do like a low-key interview. Also make sure you introduce yourselves beforehand so that you get to know the person and it's a bit more comfortable when you're just asking them questions. Interruptions also, right? I have a cat, which can be pretty annoying, and she can be super loud sometimes. So when that happens, our biggest tip is just wait for 5 seconds and then continue talking, because then we can edit that out super easily. And then let the guest redo an answer if needed. Be flexible with your guests. Make sure that they're comfortable and they feel ready to talk about all their experiences. And also, super important to have fun. And a good way to do that is just pretend that the conversation isn't being recorded and you're going to be like listened to by a bunch of different people in the world. But don't think about that. Just like try to have a cool conversation.
All right, now we're going to go into some of the more general stuff about creating your own podcast and how to find a good theme and things like that. So, we're going to be talking about how to find the topic or theme for your podcast. We're going to be talking about youth-adult partnerships, because with a lot of podcasts, there's an adult leading it, but you want it to also be led by the youth and it to be a mutually beneficial relationship. We're going to talk about how to keep youth engaged in the work, involved in it, actually enjoying the work rather than it being like a chore for them. And then we're also going to talk about the difficulties and strengths of virtual versus in-person podcasting, because we have done it virtually for the past, year or so. All right, so themes, they don't have to be completely unique. It can be a pretty broad topic. Even if there's 1,000 other podcasts that have the same theme or topic, as long as you make it unique to yourself, it's going to be a great podcast. Make sure it's something that you're very interested in. You don't want to make a podcast about something that you don't like. That's not going to be a fun experience. Don't be too narrow on your subject. You want to keep it kind of broad. So, for example, we had mental health as our broad topic, and then we had specific like subtopics of the way social media affects mental health, intersectionality within mental health, how online school affects that. So we're able to create all of these individual episodes related to that. Now, I want everyone to put in chat, what is a topic that you could talk about for hours without any preparation? So just pop that in the chat. It's a very broad topic. I like that one. Some random American war. I see someone took AP US history. Food, social justice, ice cream. These are all great topics. I would love to listen to a podcast about any of these topics. The Good Place. I love that show. Oh my gosh.
What about you, Lane?
Oh, I said Harry Potter because
You did? Oh,
I used
nice.
to put on like a Harry Potter summer camp. That was really fun.
Like by yourself?
Well, no, with the library.
Oh,
But
okay.
anyways, thank you all for putting that in the chat. That was super fun. Let's go ahead and move on. So, how do you keep yourself and others engaged in the podcast for a long period of time? Because like it's a long podcast. It's been going for about a year now. One of the things you can do is organize fun events for your team. Maybe you do a virtual Netflix. Okay, I'm hoping y'all can hear me fine. Maybe you do a virtual Netflix watching series. Maybe you go to a park and eat some food together. There's a multitude of things you could do together that are both virtual and in person that keep people interested and enjoying it. Also, take time to cover a topic that someone truly enjoys. If there's someone in the podcast that really wants to do like an episode about a specific, part of mental health, or maybe like some specific thing like that, let them do that. Like that's they have their own like motivation to do that. Go ahead and let them do that. Interview exciting guests. You would be surprised at how many like high profile people love to be interviewed, because like it's not like that much of an inconvenience for them, and it's really cool for them to be on a podcast. So you can get some like at least decently high profile people to come onto your podcast, even if it's small, because as long as you reach out and you're like, hey, wouldn't you love to be on a podcast? Most of them will say yes. And if you can, pay people. These are youth doing the work, and it is not like a traditional job, but it's always great to give stipends when you can, for coming to meetings, for doing planning, for doing editing, all of these kinds of things, as well as paying your interviewees. So it's really nice to be able to offer guests like a $25 gift card or something like that for their time, just to like let them know that they're appreciated if you have the funding for it. If you don't, that's okay. There's only so much you can do. And then the other part of this is keeping your listeners engaged. So there's the keeping the podcast team interested and engaged, and then there's the whole listener realm, and we'll get into like the social media pieces. But
Lane,
Yeah.
I can't hear you.
Yeah. Lane. Okay,
also just like within the podcast episodes, you can like switch up the topic a little bit. So if you're talking about mental health like we are, you could talk about a movie that is heavily focused on mental health and discuss some of the characters within it, whether they're accurate representations, and this just brings like aspects of pop culture into it.
Really
so,
quick,
like,
Lane, sorry to interrupt you, but your mic dropped out when you were talking about between the giveaway and then the switching topics part, so we don't know what you said.
Very cool. Basically, you can organize fun events that bring the community together. So one example of that would be we were planning on hosting a Pride in the Park event where we would have like music playing, probably bubbles, some food, and people could just like hang out and talk, and we'd have some workshops, some educational stuff. So it'd just be a really like community building event. All right. So part 4 is the social media aspect and all the stuff outside of the podcast. So there's more than just the podcast involved. There's a whole lot that goes on around it. So some of the posts I have here. So on the left, I have a post that's about like the history of Portland's queer history prior to Stonewall, which was 1969, because that's something that I haven't seen a whole lot. And that was one of our most interacted with and shared posts. In the middle, we have a post that was created by Anna, and it's just for when we were recruiting. It was another way to reach out to people in the community and get them to join the podcast. And then to the right, we do a post for every single episode that we make. So it just like lets people know that it's up, a short description of what it is, so that people are interested in people get interested in it. And we've seen that boost our listeners. So with social media, you want to be very consistent with posting. Try to set a schedule every week, like we're going to post on Tuesdays, or we're going to post on Wednesdays, whatever that may be, so that people know when you're going to be there and you stay an active account. You can use geotagging, where you add a location to the post, and that, gets a more localized group of people to view the post, and use relevant hashtags. So I usually try to use at least 10 to 15 hashtags for every post. Um, you can make it as relevant or irrelevant as you want. Within your Instagram feed, try to stick with a theme. So we use Canva a lot to create our posts, and you can use like similar templates so that it creates a cohesive theme. And then make your post like colorful. People want to see a pop of color on a page that'll just like draw their eye in. So don't make it like bland, because no one's gonna look at your post then. To get more followers, try reaching out to like larger social media accounts that have more followers than you, and be like, hey, I would love if you could share us on your story, and I'll share you on my story. And that'll get you more recognition from like, local community groups. So we reached out to places like the Q Center, that's like a queer
Lane, we can't hear you anymore. We cannot hear you.
now.
Maybe you try to switch to your computer mic, Lane. Or it just could be the connection. I'm not sure. Anna, do you want to jump in with a slide while we're waiting for Lane to come back?
Sure. I think we're kind of on the taking breaks part. So let people know when. Oh, are you back, Lane?
Am I back?
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Did you finish the followers piece?
No.
Okay. Mention your social media in your podcast episodes so that your listeners actually follow it. You can literally just be like, hey, welcome to the podcast. Follow us on Instagram at, and then put your whatever your ad is. It just gets more people to follow you. With taking breaks, let people know if you're going to peace out, because they don't like inactive social media accounts. Avoid it whenever possible, because you lose a lot of followers and interaction when you go inactive. But if it's necessary for mental health, of course, do that. Yeah, that's about it. You can also promote posts on Instagram and Facebook. So if you have the funding to do that, go ahead and do that, because it's a fun time. Awards. So our podcast is pretty cool. It's been recognized by a couple of organizations, including Sources of Strength. So we won like the best team podcast, and it does take some time to put in the applications. We had to like take videos of ourselves like talking about what we do, and we had to like fill out the paragraphs of information about who we are. But we won $1,000 from Sources of Strength, which was super cool. It helped to fund a lot of our programming. And then we also were recognized by the Adolescent Health Initiative at their like annual thing for the Youth Visual Arts Award recipient. And that was just super cool. We got like only $50 off of that, but it was cool to be recognized as a podcast. And some of the other things we've done, we reached out to like a magazine in Portland, and we were featured in that, which was super cool. Lauren was the engineer of that. All right, I think that's all I have for awards. Can you hear me right now? I don't know if it's very loud. Okay.
We can hear you just.
Okay. So we're gonna jump into closing now, but start thinking of some questions to ask us if you have any, because we're finishing up now. So what's the future of this podcast? It's been going for a bit. We have lots of plans on what we want to do with it. One of those is that it's self-sustaining. And so what we mean by this is, when we first started this podcast, we got a massive grant of like $18,000 to start this off. And so that funded purchasing mics, that funded purchasing equipment, subscriptions to certain services. But we want this to be able to run without the addition of like $18,000 grants every year, right? So we want to train people to be able to run the podcast. We want to build leaders within the podcast who can, run it without necessarily having to have an adult facilitator there all the time. So this is both like an opportunity for mentorship within the podcast, as well as just like creating a self-sustaining thing that can run for hopefully many years. We also want to, have more partner organizations.
Lane, we can't hear you again.
Would you be interested in partnering with the organization like DC?
Interview them, do podcasts with them, all that kind of thing. Places like
Sorry, Lane, hold on. You dropped out and a question was asked while you were dropped out for a second. Shamai, you want to re-ask your question?
Yeah, so I asked Lane is his name. Would he be interested in partnering with an organization in DC? Like, will you guys be interested in talking to other youth amongst DC?
Not to speak for the entire podcast, but absolutely. I think we would be delighted to partner with any organization that's interested in partnering, and we're happy to go virtual. So
yeah, we'll have our contact information at the end if you want to email us.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
All right.
So you cut off right in the middle of partner orgs.
Very cool. Basically, I just gave a couple examples of partner organizations, but we want to continue building those relationships because it's great for us, it's great for the partner organizations, and it helps build community. Another thing we want to do is grow our social media. So both grow in terms of followers and like interaction, but as well as the different kinds of social media. So we know that we're going to reach a very different audience on Instagram versus Facebook, right? So we want to try to expand into as many platforms as possible. And so this includes places like TikTok, Snapchat, Facebook, Twitter, all of these places where we can interact with different like groups of people. And so once we have a more dedicated social media team, hopefully we'll be able to do more of that. We also want to continually, maintain diversity within our podcast. So I know we mentioned earlier, like we only have 3 white people here today to present the podcast. And while there are a host of diverse people within our podcast, we want to just continue to maintain that as one of our goals. If we're going to be focusing on a BIPOC and LGBTQ, issues, we want to have those people represented within the podcast. And so we want to do intentional recruitment when we're recruiting a new cycle of people. We want to go out to high schools where we know there are those marginalized communities and do intentional recruitment there to draw those people in. We also want to broaden our community impact. And so this can look like hosting more events outside of the podcast that are beneficial to the community in any way. And really just, interacting with the people within Portland, as well as, all of the United States and Oregon in a bigger way. And then finally, increased listeners. So obviously the goal of a podcast is kind of to reach as broad an audience as possible. And so we want to figure out innovative ways to increase our listener count. We did a really cool like sticker campaign earlier this year where we printed off like 1,000 stickers and gave them out to businesses in Portland and put them on like bus stops and stuff like that. And we saw like a growth of about 100 listeners through that. So there's a lot of things we want to do in the future of the podcast in order to increase listeners, get more engagement, all that kind of stuff. And with that, I believe we will open up the floor to questions, comments, anything else like that.
Okay, we have a question. What are some questions one should never ask an interviewee or guest? That's a good one. I think the biggest one, it kind of depends on what they're presenting. And just like, if it's a broad topic, you don't always want to go into like their personal life unless they want to. Yeah, so just like feeling the waters when you interview someone and don't like try to force anything out of them just to make your interview sound good. Yeah, that's my big tip.
And honestly, Alexandria, what I usually do is I send over the list of questions that I've created about a week before I do the interview so that they can look it over. And if they want to make any adjustments, I'm super flexible with that. I can be like, yep, we totally don't have to do that question. I also make it clear that they're allowed to pass, or not that they're allowed, they're able to pass on any question that they want to during the interview, and we'll just edit that part out. But in general, I would say don't ask something like political unless it's a political issue. And don't like go into their personal life too much unless it's about their personal life. So kind of just stay mostly on topic, honestly. If you have anything to add, Lauren or Nicole or anybody else.
I just have one more thing, that also if they realize that they like didn't like what they said, be flexible with them in editing that out if they want to do that. Alrighty, next question.
Oh, I
It was
have something to
go
add
ahead,
on
Lauren.
that. Just respect your interviewees' boundaries and and make sure they're comfortable with whatever it is, and make sure you lay out those boundaries when possible.
Okay. The next question we got was, what's something you learned about podcasting while doing your podcast? So the number one thing for me was that it's really helpful to have a quiet space, and to bring your dog inside before you record and things like that, because there was a lot of trial and error. So like I now record like under my covers in my bedroom. I just throw a blanket over my head because it helps keep the outside noise out. I always have a glass of water next to me because your voice gets really nasty if you're not drinking water regularly. Um, just basic things like that to improve sound quality. Not typing on your computer while you're recording because that comes through in the sound, and also just how to maintain like a smooth conversation with someone even if you don't find them interesting. So I did do a few interviews where I did not find the person interesting and I was bored doing the interview, but I was able to use transitions and keep the conversation going even though they weren't like super responsive to my questions, and it made it an okay episode. So those are my things.
Yeah, also, I think an important thing to remember is like even if sometimes your audio isn't correct or like you don't really love all the way you sound once you've like heard everything, um, as long as you are like getting to the topic and you're addressing the things you want and you're not using like the most amazing vocabulary or you're not telling the best stories, like as long as you're getting to the point and you're telling them what you want to say, I think that's fine. Like, you shouldn't worry too much about having the perfect episode. Our next question: have you ever just not posted an episode because you didn't turn out how you wanted, or your followers got upset that you missed a week? I don't think our followers have ever like gotten upset about that, but like we have had times where we like sometimes we don't record an episode like we're about to, and then we don't because we're like we don't have the right people for this or something like that.
Yeah, one of the things I will just talk about really quickly, because the people who were in the episode aren't here right now. We had an episode, we did a short series about acronyms. So we did an LGBTQ plus episode and a BIPOC episode. And then the BIPOC episode happened, the day came, and not everybody showed up. So what we ended up having was we had a youth who identified as Chicano, and we had two youth who identified as Vietnamese American. And we recorded the whole episode, and at the end of it, we're really missing a lot of people from this BIPOC acronym, and we don't feel like it's a great representation of what we're trying to get across to folks. So we scrapped that entire episode. It was never aired. And we waited about a week. We also don't do weekly episodes. We do bi-weekly episodes as well, to at least give us some time just in case things like that do happen. Especially when you're working with teens, like we're not necessarily always working with professionals that are going to be able to, that remember when their schedules are, things like that. Another tip people give is to make sure you're sending reminders, but even then, sometimes that doesn't work out. So we're really lucky in that aspect. And I think because we're a little, what's the word, flexible, is that makes people also kind of not, our followers aren't too demanding of us at this point.
And just to add on to that, there are times where I was interviewing someone and they had like a lot of technical difficulties getting into the like software for whatever reason, so we weren't able to record at that point. So you're going to encounter hiccups no matter what. Like I was interviewing a professional in his field and he just wasn't able to get in, and it wasn't his fault, but it happened. And so what I did was I like immediately set up like a second time to record. We got the episode out like 2 days later, something like that, and it wasn't a big problem.
Dakota, I'll address your next question. Were the interviewees upset since they took time to get interviewed and it was scrapped? So luckily the interviewees are people that we knew, like people I know because they were in Yak and Yachts, and we still paid them. We still were like, listen, you took your time out of your day, you still need to get paid for doing this work. And we also asked them too if we gave them an opportunity to come back for the next episode. It just didn't work with their schedule. So we let them know like, hey, we definitely want you on here and to hear your voice still if you're able to make the time. So yeah, so that's why they were not upset, thankfully. But I could definitely see that being an issue. But just, being transparent about things, I think, of course, is going to be your best bet with all of that. And if you can, still compensate them in some way. And also, we're planning on doing further episodes. We're like, hey, we'll let you know. We really want you to come back because your voice is still really important. So we're going to keep you in the loop for other interviews that we do. Any other questions about podcasting, being a young person podcasting, recruiting, social media, any of that stuff?
When you guys first started out with your podcast, what was the process like getting people to engage and actually listen to your podcast?
I mean, it was difficult because like, I don't know, getting people to listen to the podcast is hard just because I don't know, most of the people that I talked to were like, "Oh yeah, I'll totally listen to it," and like it sounds super interesting, and then they never ended up listening to it or something like that. And then with like getting youth to join, I feel like we started off with a pretty strong base already because we're connected to youth action councils and student health centers within the Portland area, so we were able to do recruitment through those to get people to watch or to get people to do the podcast. Yeah, I don't know if someone else wants to add on to that.
No,
Okay.
Really quickly, I would go off with what Elaine said is like, specifically, we sent the information to orgs that serve youth so that they would share it with folks as well. Lane and Leanne are two people that do our social media, and they reached out to other organizations who were like, hey, can you share this? They just like, Lane especially just went off and just emailed and messaged as many people as he could. So it's, I mean, honestly, and we're taking a little bit of a break over the summer, but like when we're on, it's always be plugging. Like if I'm at an event, if I'm doing something for work, I'm like, hey, also listen to our podcast. And, with Lane, Lauren, and Anna, and then they'll tell other people to listen to it. They get those stickers out into the world. Lauren, like I said, got that magazine article. It's just like any opportunity you can have to talk about it, bring it up and talk about it. Just always, and they'll call you like Shemaya, the one who has the podcast, because you talk about it so much. That's really, word of mouth is a really important way to get things going with that. So if you're not talking about it all the time, then people aren't going to hear about it.
Okay. I have one last question. And this question, I would prefer everyone that is in the podcast to respond. But if you could give one piece of advice to someone just starting out a podcast or just starting out to reach out to other young people, what would your advice be?
I can go first. I think that when you first start out, you feel like your numbers are nothing, and like it can still feel like that. And try not to get lost in that. Just remember why you made the podcast in the first place, right? To talk about something you enjoy. Make sure that it stays that way, that you remind yourself that. And also just like you have to put out episodes with the faith that at some point people will recognize it and be like, that's a cool idea. You just have to have confidence in your idea and keep going with it. And if it's not getting the numbers where you want, then it's still a cool thing because you're talking about something you love. So
Thank you.
One thing I would have is get to know your team members, like inside and outside of the podcast, just because like when you form those connections, it makes doing the work that you're doing so much easier.
Good. Thanks.
I would just say do the podcast for yourself. Like, don't focus so much on the numbers and who's listening and whether or not you're getting the engagement you want. Like, of course, that's an important aspect of it, but you should be doing it because you're enjoying it and you enjoy talking about it and learning from all these people that you're interviewing. So if you can find like self motivation from it, or like, be motivated to do it on your own rather than just like focusing on, ooh, this one got 100 views and this one got 120, that's going to make it much more sustainable in the long run. And you're not going to be so discouraged when you like post an episode that you worked really hard on and it only got like 40 listens or something like that. You're going to be like, this is a great episode, I love making it, and I learned so much.
Thank you.